Welcome to our growing open panel. My name is Keith McDonald, moderator for this session, and we've got an interesting group of folks. To be sure, going to get right to it and introduce them now. I'd like you to welcome James Cohen, who's Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. James, on the camera, welcome. Sidra Mahmood is Open Data Lead, Employment and Social Development Canada. Welcome, Sidra. Derek Alton, Head of Community Apolitical, all the way from the UK today. And William Wolfe-Wylie, Manager, Data Services and Open Data Chief Data Office, Employment and Social Development Canada as well. All the way from, it looks like, I don't know, the mountain community out in, I'm just going to speculate, BC. I think it's a wonderful background. So welcome, William. So this is our panel, and I'm going to just allow you some time to just tell me a little bit about yourself and tell our viewers, of course, what's your thing and your expertise here that you're going to bring to the table. We can start with James, if you like.
Hi, everybody. Sorry for a close-up of hands. I'm doing this from my phone for various technical reasons. My name is James Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Issues of open government are of interest to Transparency International chapters around the world. We have over 100 country chapters around the world, of which TI Canada is one. And here we've been working on things like especially beneficial ownership transparency with the tabling of Bill C-42 for a national registry. We're really excited about that, so we can get into it. We've been also looking into issues of how dirty money relates to property in cities in Canada. We can talk about that as well. And looking at issues around transparency of permitting and processing issues such as environmental assessment. So happy to talk about all these issues and various other ones.
Thank you, James. And Sidra.
Hi, folks. So my name is Sidra Mahmood. My pronouns are they, them. Essentially, I'm currently the Open Data Lead at the Chief Data Office at Employment and Social Development Canada. And prior to that, I was a Code for Canada Fellow as a Senior Designer with the Benefits Delivery and Modernization team. I was basically a designer that said, I need better data to work with. So why don't I just make the leap into data and policy instead? And then part of that, I was with the City of Toronto as the UX designer for the Open Data program, which is a super exciting time because prior to that, I didn't know what open data was. And now it's all I know how to talk about. I'm especially passionate about transparency, specifically in the realm of building products with data for public consumption. So I'm a big believer that policies and products don't have feelings, people do. So I have no problem ripping something apart if I don't feel that it's in the best interest of the public. Also just around, inclusivity, not talking about data in a vacuum, legitimizing and validating different ways of knowing, not just, STEM-based approaches, thinking about interdisciplinary ways to engage communities and holding their governments accountable, because essentially we work for you. And that's it about me.
Very cool. Derek.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Derek Alton. As you can tell from my very thick Canadian accent, I'm originally from Canada, but currently reside in London, England, here for the coronation, not actually, but my background is I have been working in and around government for 15 years now, really passionate about how do we transform government. And through my passion and interest in transforming government, I became very interested in this whole idea of open data, open government, open society, and sort of jumped in with 2 feet into the open space within Canada, while working for the government of Canada at the intersection of tech, society, and government for many years. Through that, helped form the Canadian Open Data Society, and really became obsessed with this question of like, how do we build a movement for open? And so I started that in Canada, but have more recently started taking this global. And so now I am the community insights lead for an organization called Apolitical, which is really about creating a global platform to help connect public servants around the world and really bring about sort of a 21st century government that works for people on the planet. So now I'm building global networks of people working on open, among many other topics. And yeah, just excited to dig into this conversation today.
Very good, sir. And to William.
Hi, I'm William Wolfe-Wylie, and I am the Manager of Open Government and Open Data at ESDC, Employment and Social Development Canada. Prior to this, I spent close to 20 years in Canadian journalism, liberating data and hacking data from that side of the fence. I was giving deputations on why municipalities should open more data and writing somewhat aggressively about the lack of open data in whatever publication would let me. And about 2 years ago, some very, very kind and questionably wise person asked me if I'd like to see what the data looks like from the government side of the fence and manage the open data program from this side. So that was too good an offer to pass up. And so now I'm working with Sidra and another wonderful third member of our team named Lindsay, who we're tackling the open data problem from the government side, building the systems, building the processes, and building the automation flows that will actually liberate more into the general public. And swapping the fences it's been a really interesting adventure. Very grateful to have this chance.
It's very interesting to me as well, because when this panel was being formed, I realized I've met most of you, and William and Sidra in particular, in my work when I was with the City of Toronto. And yeah, I did sample your wares, William. We had many a counter, and some of them were quite enlightening, shall we say, in a good way. So it's wonderful to talk to you again, especially in your new capacities. And we're going to deal with growing open today. What can we do to move forward? And I think it's interesting with what I just said, because that would have been around 2010, 11, 12, and so on, the early days of open data. So the years have gone by, and I'm wondering what your take would be on where open data is at right now. What are we looking at in terms of where we have to go? Like, what kind of growth are we really talking about? And is this an old conversation? I mean, is there anything we need to do really immediately to get those seeds in the ground and growing? And I think I'll start with William. Why not? Comment on that.
Right now, it's a question of capacity of the organizations. And I speak really from my perspective as a manager on this front. There is so much data, and we're all hyper aware of how much data there is, from organizing the programs, to the research that fed into program development, to the actual delivery, to the payment data, to the client data. Everything is out there. But there are very few people across a government organization who are actually tasked with figuring out what portions of it should be opened up to the general public and what portions are appropriate to. Our little team of 3 people is actually one of the few organizations that can proactively reach out and say, this is a great idea. More people should see this. And for a lot of people and especially people who care about this deeply, it's a side of desk task that they have to figure out how to work into their regular work. And when their regular work is taking up already all of their time, finding that segment of their time is sometimes difficult. So what our team is trying to do is create a really, really deeply easy and supportive structure that will onboard people, that will try and create more collaborative environments so that we can be more targeted with what we open up, and we can be faster with how we keep it updated and how we actually get stuff published on the web. Because from the journalism side, one of the frustrating parts was that you might see an open data release and then it's 4 years out of date. You might see an open data release, but there's no contact information, or the contact information is outdated. And we hadn't built in that ongoing governance structure yet. And so it's fortunate now we can sort of take those frustrations that we had in the earlier days of open data, when Keith and I were hanging out in an office in the city of Toronto, trying to figure out what could make this real. And now, a decade later, try and really tackle it from a governance perspective, and try and tackle it from an automation and a technical perspective, to just make it targeted, but also easy for the people who care about it to actually engage with it. Because in the end, it's a human capacity question. And we can now use technology to improve the human capacity, and also just make those people who care about it internally feel supported in how they tackle it.
Interesting. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Yes.
Happy to weigh in a little bit on that. So William and I work on the same team, right? So it's pretty interesting, the parallels in our day-to-day. I feel like we absolutely cannot grow open without really thinking carefully about what it looks like to be driven by values and driven by the issues that actually impact people. Like, I'm saying this as somebody that works on, data sets where we're thinking about, like, we're about to release like concordance tables for knock codes. Who's that going to be interesting to? And the big key piece here is, like, talking to our data stewards and asking them why, and thank you to William again for encouraging us to do this, but like, why is it that you think you want to publish this? Like, what is the value? Because typically all these publications are being fed in from, like, well, there's like a ministerial ask, or like, my director has demanded that this data be published. And I really want to flip that a little bit and think about, what does it look like for, somebody in our country who's a member of the public to be able to say, hey, like, I want to know what it is that my government's doing. I think about, like, all of these big social issues that have a lot of impact, especially on my generation right now, things like affordable housing, things like employment supports, delivery of services. I'm somebody that didn't necessarily get the benefits that they were supposed to get on time before I was employed by the same department that provides these benefits to folks. So, when we talk about things like inclusion and getting the public engaged, like you can't do that without really appealing to the public based on the topics that they're interested in. And I feel really fortunate because at ESDC, like we are the holders of all this like incredible employment support data. We have information about all of the funding behind all of these programs that you might have participated in at some point. Like it's really fascinating, but it's more so around internally making the case. And I'm like, no, the public cares. This is actually really interesting. I think about social media. I think about how it takes no trouble at all for somebody to post pictures of their dogs or like me and get really excited. And I sincerely feel that we can get the public as excited about participation in like civic and democratic processes by virtue of open data. We just need to do, I think as like organizationally, just need to do a little bit better of a job of meeting them where they're at. And like I have a lot of thoughts on that, but ultimately, I really think like let's make sure that the data that we're delivering is aligned with what's of interest to the public, and maybe not the other way around, where we're trying to construct a narrative that might not necessarily be there.
Interesting. Thumbs up from your boss there. James, I want to clarify too, the Transparent International Canada, that's separate from government, or are you getting any funding there? Or?
Yeah, we are an independent organization. We have one program where we do get funds from the Global Affairs Canada to do work overseas, but we are independent from, we're an independent nonprofit charity.
The reason I'm asking is it looks like we got a panel that's got kind of double experience. You've been on the outside looking in, and now you're looking in to the outside. So I think, Sidra, your comments about what I call just folks, right? The mechanics and hairdressers and so on, is really relevant. And am I right in saying, though, then that you would agree that priority is reaching that audience? To grow open data, you need to make this known, accessible to the outside? I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those comments were really interesting about meeting the public where they are and not forcing, not prioritizing data that maybe the public doesn't need, and getting it out there in an interesting way. So I was part of the Open Government Partnership Multi-Stakeholder Forum on the federal side. And so speaking to federal government agencies about their open government plans and the data they got out, I spoke with some departments whose information I knew nothing about. I was really new to it. So say Environment Canada, showing me lots of very, very interesting data. And I suppose if you're like in a niche area, some of the data is quite interesting for geologists or whatnot. But if you're somebody, say, in a local community, or not even realizing that you need this information, it also helps to have storytelling as well. And this was something that I think from a civil society side, we can support the government's initiatives, because an organization like ours, we will take a government, a level of the government to task if we don't feel that it's moving on transparency or accountability in some way. But we do want to promote good practice. We don't want to embed cynicism in the public. And so when the government does put forward data, I think it's incumbent on civil society organizations in this realm to talk to other civil society organizations and the public audience that we've got a hold of, to tell them, hey, change does happen, transparency does happen. It's not worth just sitting there saying, oh, the government's always hiding things. It is part of our responsibility to show them how that the data is there and that it is useful for their causes. And so I think there's opportunities to collaborate between civil society and government to amplify the effects of getting that data out there and showing communities how it is useful for them and the causes and the changes that they are trying to achieve.
Well said. I think, Derek, viewers might be very well interested in the fact that, we've got local municipalities, Ontario, then federal. And so you've got some experience now outside of the local and the federal into the world, as you were saying in your introduction. I'm wondering what you're seeing as variables, or is it the same? Is there a common lack of awareness, or are there some really bright spots? think you're muted, Derek.
Yep, technology. Yeah, there are definitely some bright spots. I mean, obviously the one that people always point to is Estonia. It's a very sort of example of a country that's really data driven in terms of how they do things, and the openness of their data makes it very easy for lots of different organizations and groups to add services on top of the open data that's provided by government. Taiwan's done some really interesting examples of processes, open processes. We're talking about sort of more open society, and they've done it through unlocking their data as well. So those are sort of two sort of shining lights. But I think part of it is like the vast majority of people don't care about open data, and we have to accept that and be okay with that. And I think what's interesting for me about this is realizing that more and more people are engaging with open data through intermediaries. So the vast majority of people won't actually touch open data, but what they will do is they'll engage with open data through other sources, whether it's academics who are using the open data and then turning that into pieces of information. Journalists are a big one that's using open data. One that I'm increasingly interested to watch, and this is where Estonia becomes an interesting example of seeing this in action, is more and more people are engaging with open data through bots, like AI. Is becoming an intermediate. It's going to become a major intermediary in terms of how people engage with that. And there's a whole bunch of ethical issues to talk about around that, because I think when we talk about open data, there's sort of two key aspects that I like to look at. One is about access. Usually when we talk about open data, we talk about access, being able to access the data. But there's a whole nother side, which is this idea of ownership. Who owns the data, who has control of the data, and how that data can be made sense of. And that's the part that we haven't really dug into too much. And I think that on a global scale is becoming an increasingly hot button issue of who owns the data, because everything's becoming more political. The world's becoming more political. And maybe another way of saying that is, instead of saying more political, we're realizing that data isn't neutral. And the data was never neutral. We just didn't think about it. And now we're starting to think about it more. And so as we realize the data is not neutral, all of a sudden the question of who owns the data becomes more important. So I know I'm taking a bit of different directions, but I want to sort of throw some interesting sort of topics into the mix here about, these are topics that are starting to percolate in other parts of the country or other parts of the world more than I've seen it happen in Canada yet. And I think it'd be great to see these conversations get some more energy in Canada.
It leads me to think about AI as well. I mean, open data used to be the cool kids. You know, we were all cool kids working on open data. It was real exciting. And it's less so now. I mean, it's to some degree, I don't know whether you agree with me, but it's kind of a little passé, and it never really entrenched yet. With AI bubbling up, you know, there's a convergence really of data, certainly, and how open data may or may not impact AI, bringing up, as you're talking about, all the other issues, right? There's privacy and ownership and agency, all of that. I'm interested to Sidra's comment, though, about, you know, reaching the audiences and going where the audiences go. And we did a session yesterday, myself and Yuzhnish Senguda, Yuzhnish in particular, on ChatGPT. And I'm just going to throw this out. Do you think open data folks should start using ChatGPT on how to sell open data? I mean, is this a core issue that you're not selling it well enough? That's to the panel, whoever would like to.
I mean, go for it. Go. Well, I was going to say, we've run into a problem. So at Apolitical, we've run into a problem with ChatGPT because it's based in the United States. And there are like GDPR rules around data management and data control. And so that's become a hindrance for us in terms of using stuff like ChatGPT. And a lot of the major AI engines are based out of the United States. So that does make it a bit of an awkward one. But the other thing is that there's been a lot of controversy around where this data is coming from, and is it truly open data, or maybe it isn't truly open data that they got access to, and it's become quite controversial.
James?
Yeah, I'll pick up on that thread right there, because we spend a lot of time when we're looking at a data set to open, figuring out the best way to present it, the most useful way to present it, because we can't just open up, say, the EI files, because there's just colossal amounts of personally identifiable information. There's privacy legislation. There's a lot of concerns with that. Also, it's huge. And it's spread across so many tables, across so many jurisdictions with so many people responsible for it, that no, we can't open up EI to open data. But what we can do is send it through a collection and transformation and an aggregation that protects individual privacy and makes portions of that data useful to people. So we go through a lot of effort to try and figure out, is there an internationally recognized standard that makes this useful to, you know, Google Maps? Is there an internationally recognized standard that makes it useful to transit or apps that people have agreed upon? Is there any kind of academic research that requires us to be publishing by these variables. They're aggregated in the right way to make them particularly useful to that group. And that becomes a really, really interesting point on what we release and how we release from this perspective, because what ChatGPT ingests, what these AI programs ingest, is deeply flawed in some ways. And if we can actually figure out how that point of ingestion works from our perspective, we can actually feed them better structured data to make the output of those apps more reliable.
Ingestion or indigestion, perhaps.
I think there's
Exactly.
one thing to be said about, like, when, of course, ChatGPT is in the news and so is AI, but I think there's something going back to the comment about meeting the public where they are, not letting the latest tech story drive the idea of that's where all the public is to use data. I think it's going back to, especially at the municipal level, and especially if you get down to vulnerable groups who might even have challenges with internet connection, let alone figuring out ChatGPT. There's that kind of thing. So I think before government goes chasing the cart of how do we optimize and everything for ChatGPT or other AI sources, or how do we put all of our limited resources that we have towards thinking about this, first getting right back to that core. And I really do like, as a function of government, who are we serving and what do they need the most, and finding them there. So it might turn out that there are civil society groups or other groups or open maps or things like that where it does make sense, because most people will have a smartphone, and the idea to access where to find like physically where to go talk to somebody, that makes sense. But profiling, first of all, what the needs are of the public that they might not even know, and connecting it to what you have, is a good exercise. And then whenever we even get into data, are we talking about these vast databases, or are we talking about the data of decision-making processes, for example, and the murkiness around that? And how do you make a decision-making process more transparent and more tangible for the public? So these are, yes, keep an eye on, go where the puck is, essentially, because you don't want to be left behind, but don't let that dictate everything you're doing.
I just want to add that, to clarify too, I was talking specifically not so much using it for analysis, but to do the campaign for you. Speaking as a communications guy, when I worked in government, my boss got me a program called Write Writer. And I used to find talking about literacy writing levels and stuff almost impossible to convince people. But once I started using this tool, they went, oh, well, the tool said it. Maybe you're right? So I'm wondering if you'd have more success by saying, hey, ChatGPT just generated this full marketing plan for you, how we're going to use Twitter and LinkedIn and so on, if you'd have more uptake. But I digress. I do think it's an important point, how you reach the citizens, for sure. And but is it too much of a niche that, maybe reaching the citizens isn't as relevant as getting, as you say, the quality and fulfilling the promise of presenting the data to those who may find it useful, even if it's a narrow community?
I'd like to speak on this, because I think Derek earlier touched on the concept of intermediaries. And like, I am somebody that, after 5 years in government, I live in constant fear of digital transformation and software procurement, primarily because I don't often find that we're taking like this pain points, like this approach of wanting to solve people's pain points, right? Like, data is sexy right now, it's all over the place. And as a result, it's being spoken of constantly in this vacuum. As a sense of like, well, we all need to become data literate. We all need to make sure that like the public is engaged in it. And I'm like, honestly, it's okay if they don't care. It's fine. And I say that like data is not sexy because at its core, really great open data practices, your best open data set is going to be completely unformatted. It's going to be completely cleansed of most of its context. It's going to just have these raw values so anybody can just jump in and use them as they see fit, right? And that part is not as exciting for the public, but I think our responsibility as the folks that deliver that data is not to like follow up and make sure that the data products that are being created, or the web applications, or whatever's being built as a result of our stuff is standing up. It's more so that focus on like the inherent and intrinsic quality of the data that we're providing the public with. so like oftentimes, even internally, I'm having a lot of conversations internally around what data storytelling is about. And oftentimes it's like, you show up to a meeting with like senior management and they don't have a lot of time. And oftentimes, we're showing them these, all of these dashboards and all of these, visualizations. And what I find is sometimes we're missing like what my old boss, Denise Carr, used to say, getting to the candy, which is really like that whole idea around what is the point? Like maybe just because it's work doesn't mean it's meaningful or useful work. Just because we're showing people a whole bunch of tables we've created, that's not useful. Why don't we just extract like the one key insight that we want people to pay attention to? Like, for example, check out these SERP tables. Here's this big, insight that we've been able to extract out of that, while still making it available for people to do whatever they'd like with it. I just find like 90% of the focus in like data spaces in government, and this is me being self-critical, is on like what you can deliver with that data, as opposed to like that intrinsic question around like, let's get that data like reliable so that all these third-party tools that are, I'm looking at you, Service Canada, like all these third-party tools and folks that are trying to work with this data to create services for people. Let's make it so that our sole source of data is actually reliable and updated and, something that people can actually lean on. If we can start there, then I'm happy to see, I think sky's the limit, but ultimately like, we're chapters and the author of the books, but we're not like reselling the books. I don't know. That's a terrible analogy, but you get what I mean. I think government is better at distributing data than building things.
Speaking of Denise Carr, giving a shout out, Denise has asked a question, so maybe we'll get to that right now. He'd be interested to hear the thoughts on the panel about the value utility of an organization having an internal open data portal, not a data mart, data lake, insert buzzword, but something that could use, sorry, the chat just flipped up. Something that could be used potentially as both a tool to show utility of simple data sharing internally and as a potential staging area for future open data releases. The thought is something, sometimes practicing sharing on a small internal scale may benefit the long-term sharing on a larger scale. Any thoughts on that? William.
It's under active development. Basically, internally there is it's a data inventory / a data catalog, which is just a list of data sets with associated metadata and contact information to the people who manage it. It's not beyond that at this point because it's still a relatively new idea, but there's absolutely recognized value in knowing what exists internally and who controls access to it, what the governance rules around it are. How can we query it / partner with you to work together on it / get a quick little export of it, because it might inform a really interesting part about our work if we make a linkage along this column right here. There's absolutely value in that, and it's creating a broader culture of internal sharing slowly but surely. That work is ongoing and it's lovely to watch unfold.
And so just to clarify, when we say internal, so the idea is that this is a open data portal that's internal to government. So people outside of government wouldn't have access to it, but people inside government do, which enables flowing of data information across the departments instead of having it siloed like it so often is.
Which means not open data, but definitely does mean sharing internally as a culture of not hiding what you have and no one else can see.
And to be clear, I think it's a great idea. I was just trying to clarify on that.
I think that's the intent. Denny could weigh in if it's not. But actually, you're right. It's not open data to the public, but it's still, in a sense, fulfilling the dream of open data, right? You're making it open to other divisions. And I could call, when I was working for the city of Toronto, we would have divisions asking other divisions for data, and they would refuse to offer it for one reason or another. And if it got to open data, what you'd have is that division then going to the open data website to get the data. And it's very interesting how sometimes the back end of these things functions. And I don't know if that's still current, but it was one of those back in the day issues, right? And if it's still around, it does show that there's a lot of growing that still has to happen.
Well, I think,
oh, go ahead, sir.
So I was just gonna say, I think one thing that highlights for me that I think is important to bring to this conversation is that I think we're now at a state of maturity in the conversation around openness to see that it's not sort of black and white, like it's open or it's closed, but instead it's almost like a gradient in different levels of access and different levels of ownership at different stages. That it's not a binary. It's much more complex, and we are now at a place I think we can engage with that complexity in some interesting ways.
All right, we do have a couple more comments, questions. Interested in the panel's thoughts on growing open based on 3 core principles: transparency, accountability, and being participatory. Do you like those principles? Do you want to add to them or focus on one?
I mean, I guess the thought that comes to mind for me, and I'll sort of position it in terms of what I've been thinking on over the last week a ton. At first blush, if that's the term, I like those 3 words, or those 3 terms. I think they make, or principles, I think they make a lot of sense. I think in the modern world that we live in, they've become much more difficult. And what I mean by that is that the world is becoming increasingly political, increasingly polarized, and that makes it much more difficult to be transparent. It makes it much more difficult to be accountable, and it also makes participation much more fraught. And so I think these are really good principles, but I think it's getting a lot harder to do, and particularly for governments to engage with. I don't know what the answer to that is, and that's what I'm trying to figure out. I'm writing about this right now, very political, trying to figure the answer to that question. So if anyone knows the answer of how do we navigate, how do we be transparent, accountable, and participatory in an increasingly political and chaotic world, I am keen to hear it.
James, looks like you got something to say.
Yeah, I might argue that lack of those principles creates the political polarization. Now, I know that there's opportunists who want to make things political just for their own sake, but there's something to be said about government holding everything close to its chest and saying, just trust us, and then something screws up. That allows people to say, aha, and the cynicism to grow. So there's a lot of work that government has to do to overcome decades of, all politics are corrupt and government doesn't do anything. And just open data in and of itself isn't going to get over that. But transparency, when we talk about open data, you can talk transparency about the data itself and transparency about the process of deciding the data. And I think that part is interesting, because that then leads to accountability as well. Why did we make some parts open and why did we not? Because if you put all your process on the table, there's less room. I mean, there's always going to be room for the conspiracy theories, obviously, and the partisans, but at least you've got a transparent decision-making process out there and rationality. And then that leads to accountability about who made that decision and why they made the decision, and who the public can ask and even debate that. Also, accountability goes down to letting the public know how the data was developed and the credibility of the data, especially, as you say, in the era of politics. If we go to anything like, say, on public health to make a decision where we look through this data and here's our methodology about how we did it. I think that can help the cause of open data to be a relevant source. And then participatory, this finally goes to what Sabine has been talking about and what we've kind of been developing around, is not just the government deciding in of itself, we will decide, but talking with the public and stakeholders, like this point about niche data versus what the public wants. It's probably not an either or, it's both, because there are civil society organizations with very specific focuses who know what data they need and what can help in public and policy decision-making process. But then there's also what the public wants to get, and just the end in of itself, developing trust in government is something. So working with the public and telling stories about how data is used, telling stories about how just people in the general public used it and how they want to participate. So I think that's kind of ways to actually operationalize those 3 principles.
And apropos of your comment too, we have a question comment around all data sets have a community of interest. Government often publishes open data without connecting to these communities. Should we change the prevalent publish it and they will come philosophy to work with and build relationship with communities interested in perfect data sets, particular data sets? And I just want to add a quick aside to that. Richard Pietro is moderating our lightning talk coming up after lunch. Coined a phrase, actually, I was involved in that discussion with him, called open data in reverse, which was really specifically going to communities and saying, hey, this is what we got. What interests you, and having the community build. So I'm really interested in your comments on that side. Sidra, it looks like you're ready to go. Answer.
Oh no, I just got really excited because I saw Will and I was like, yeah, we're going to answer this.
Looking at your body language. Okay, well, would you like to throw something in?
Sure. Okay, so I think a point was made earlier around like the politicization of our work, and I'm going to go on a limb and say like our work is deeply political. We as public servants, we are nonpartisan, right? In the ways in which we're delivering our services to folks, but ultimately, like my existence alone as a racialized person is political. I don't get to like excise that from my existence. So I'd like to think that when you do acknowledge that there is a politicization in this sphere, that public information, regardless of kind of what like lean it might have, it does keep people safe. It keeps them informed and empowered to question their governments when necessary. The thing with ESDC though is that we are a very risk-aware organization. Undoubtedly, we have a lot of people's personal information, right? And there's often that issue with optics, as you'll see with like the larger federal government departments. But like it doesn't mean that we're not fueled politically by the social issues that impact our communities. And I think that's where it needs to be. I think we need to be okay with having uncomfortable conversations with the public. I often find, again, being self-critical, because again, policies and programs don't have feelings, people do. I often find that the ways in which some of the community engagement pieces are structured, and I remember kind of seeing this at the city as well back in the day, they're not super conducive to participation from maybe the folks we would like to see more participation from. And that's an issue of geography, that's an issue of like literacy, that's an issue of people just not feeling like, well, like, I don't know what the word governance means, like what business do I have being in this room to participate? And I think we kind of need to spin that sideways a little bit and really think very clearly, very much about what it is that, people are passionate about. And that does mean having uncomfortable conversations. That does mean saying, actually, yeah, we've looked at like our service delivery rates. They're not up to par. We're going to face a lot of criticism, but no better way to, improve government services than to really let ourselves, I think, be a little bit vulnerable in that way. The only thing I want to touch on is like this like very tricky piece around vulnerable communities. We need data about vulnerable communities in order to make good policy, in order to better understand, things like racism or things like sexism or all sorts of different isms in society. At the same time, however, we have a responsibility to protect folks from being identified. And so oftentimes when we're collecting data on marginalized communities, those cell counts are so low that we have to suppress them. And so you end up with this like weird balancing scale of like, well, we care, we want to serve these communities, but we also can't release open data about them because it turns out these low cell counts are really easy to identify if you cross-reference data tables. So it's always this like balancing act. But again, I bring it all the way back to like lived experience is one of the best ways for us to understand what somebody's experience of something is like. And we can't do that without having really straightforward, honest, and vulnerable communications in plain language that empower regular humans to get involved. Because I know I felt really intimidated until I started to kind of get the lingo and start to learn how to do government speak. And prior to that, I was like, I don't understand a word. Because I think people care. They care.
This morning on one of our panels, actually, Indigenous community needs and around open data, and they use the term OCAP, ownership, control, access, and prevention. And it's certainly worth mentioning again. It's a pivotal issue for Canadians right now, Indigenous community and all of us. James, were you going to?
But to that point, and that's a really great example of vulnerable communities, not just getting what data do you want to help services, but the collection of data and treating the public as nodes of research. Therein goes to the principles of transparency and accountability once more. Being transparent about how you collected the data, what you're going to do with data, who is involved, and accountable to, and being transparent about the accountability of how you will treat the data to create trust with communities. And again, if you follow those, if you operationalize those principles, it can help you create something, not to say that mistakes don't get made, unfortunately, but hopefully that will be part of mitigating anything that people could construe as, the government doesn't care about us, they're not treating us properly, we're just pieces of research. But being accountable, being participatory, being transparent in the process can create that trust, which is ultimately, again, what a goal of what you're trying to do is create trust with the public and the government that this data is the public's and we can use it and we trust that it's collected and it's being used properly.
Amazing comment. I'm feeling like we're in a band, and we're just warmed up. The music is really cooking. Unfortunately, I've just been alerted. We've actually got less than 5 minutes to go, and I do want to give you a chance to summarize your points as we move on to a lunch break. Because of that, though, we might be able to not panic as much. I'm not saying we have more time, because I did want to mention one thing that I think is interesting in hearing what you were talking about, Sidra, is maybe open data needs to be aloof, something like the Ombudsman or a privacy office, or maybe even, dare I say it, the CBC, where, yeah, you're funded to some degree. I mean, think of the Twitter controversy too, as CBC being noted as but this idea of being too beholden to the powers that be, whether it be the political party in power, how entrenched is open data and independent of those things? I think it's food for further thought. So I don't really want to get into it now because of our time crunch. But let me go to each of you with a takeaway. What would you like to summarize that you feel is most important on a go-forward growing open data basis? Haven't heard from you, William, in a while, so let's start with you.
Goodness, a summary of thoughts on open data. I'm coming at this largely, I spent the better part of a decade working in news media as a software developer, and I'm approaching this a little bit from a data flow and pipelining problem. And as a journalist, I found myself wondering all the time, how could these processes take so long? Why does it take so long to get the information out? And now that we're actually managing the governance and manage the consultations, we're opening conversations right now with a number of underserved groups to consult on the data that we're releasing and how it's formatted and who owns it, and offering exactly that OCAP mentality. I understand more about that now, and I think one of the biggest ways that we can grow open data is by presenting ourselves as supportive allies internally. We can be educators, we can be supporters, we can be data pipeliners to take that side of desk work and automate it away from people. There is a whole of government directive on open government and open data, and we can help people get those check marks on their requirements without them having to do all that much work, by being supportive allies in that space. And from my perspective within government, that's really my goal at this point, is to grow it by approaching it with love, support, and empathy, and a little bit of technology and automation to make life easier for those who also care along with us.
Embrace. I love the love in the room. Derek.
Yeah, I think my key takeaways from this is sort of the realization that open data is going to be sort of an underpinning foundation on which the world we're going to go into. Is it, it's data that drives so much of what we do. The openness of that data, access to that data is going to really become very foundational, whether we realize it or not. And so that really raises the prominence of questions around access and ownership. And I think, a lot of the questions around how do we do good engagement and build the relationship between the data and the communities that data is about, and have them be in the driver's seat of it, I think it's going to become really where I'm excited to see what grows in those areas.
Awesome. Sidra.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think ultimately, like, growing open, it's not the number of data sets that you have, it's essentially how much civic society can see themselves in the work that you're doing. We're the government. It's the least we can do, in my opinion. I think the other piece around growing open is that we need to stop talking about data in a vacuum. Like, I cannot sit through one more meeting where it's like, data is good, data is really important. And like, no, let's start adding the context. Let's start adding those social lenses that really make it meaningful. So it's like, from a gender-based analysis, this is why this data means something, right? And finally, like, I'm just going to use a catchphrase from my personal hero, Miss Frizzle: take chances, make mistakes, get messy. Like, let's do it. Let's see what happens. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Wonderful. And to James.
Takeaway, it's been a wide-ranging conversation, but a fun conversation that's gone in a couple different ways, which I think points to the fact that when we think about growing open data, there's very few, if any, either ors. It's kind of looking at the data from multiple lenses, which might complicate things, especially for the government involved with getting that data open. But at the end of the day, it's worth your time to consider these and not jump on one area, whether it's do we really focus on AI and ChatGPT, or do we put all of our things, because there's limited resources, there's limited time, there's limited people to think about all these things. But again, in making that decision process of what to do next and how to approach it transparently with accountability and being as participatory as possible, I think can help get to the end point, not end point, but to the next step, because you're always going to be revising of what kind of data and how that data should be released and how it should be used.
Thank you, James. I think participating in this today, I can say one thing, open data people are still very cool. So thank you, James. Thank you, Sidra. Thank you, Derek. And thank you, William, for your participation. We value your support and your conversation with us. And like all our other panels this morning, we can certainly carry this on beyond this today. So perhaps we'll be calling on you again for some good activities. Much appreciated. And to our viewing audience, thanks for hanging in for us. We're going to have a lunch break now. And, feel free to grab some lunch and so on, washrooms or wherever they're located in your particular viewing area. In terms of housekeeping, we're coming back for 1:15 for the lightning talks moderated by our buddy Richard Pietro, who some of you know. If you don't, you'll certainly see him in action coming up at 1:15. So thanks again for hanging in. Thank you again to our panel, and we'll see folks at 1:15. If you want to just wave goodbye, everybody, Nathan our master control guy will close the meeting officially. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you.